Hi everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Nichola and I work at PayFit as a payroll expert, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today on everything you should know about contract termination. Just want to double check, everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So the topic that we're going to cover today is everything you should know about contract termination, and also how we process this in the PayFit app. So today we're going to cover why we've chosen the topic of contract termination, how to make or the process to make employees redundant, and then we're also going to look at notice pay and termination payments. We'll also have a section at the end for you guys to ask me any questions that you may have regarding redundancy or termination or anything related to how it is processed in the PayFit app. If you could please put any questions that you have in the questions tab at the bottom of the screen for me to answer for you. So why are we talking about contract termination? As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, many employers are now faced with a decision on how their business can become financially well again. Around 1 in 4 employees have been placed on furlough leave, with employers utilising the financial support from the coronavirus job retention scheme. But what happens as this scheme comes to an end, or as the amount of financial support that employers can have reduces? So for some employers, they will be able to return their employees to work on their previous working arrangements, or they may have amended working arrangements in place. But for some employers, redundancy is going to be a necessity in order for their business to continue to run. So I thought it was important to do this webinar because the process as a whole is a very difficult one for the employee and the employer. But with it being inevitable for some businesses, our aim with this webinar is to give you the knowledge and support and tools that you need to be able to manage it well. So what do we mean by making employees redundant? So the process of making employees redundant is to terminate the employee's contract, either because your business is changing what it does or how it does what it does, or potentially even because it's closing down. Now, regardless of whether your employees are back at work or they are still on furlough leave, redundancy is a legal process and must be handled sensitively and correctly. Now, with most legal processes, there are some risks, and some of the biggest risks in the redundancy process are discrimination. And this is where employees are selected for redundancy because of a personal or protected characteristic such as age or a disability, rather than the ACAS recommended criteria such as the standard of work or the employee's skills or qualifications or the employee's disciplinary record. As well as this, another risk is not following the correct consultation process, which is based on the number of redundancies you are making. So you must go through a meaningful consultation process if you are making 20 or more employees redundant. If you are making 20 to 99 employees redundant, you should have a 30-day consultation period. If you are making more than this redundant, you should operate a 45-day consultation period. Now, redundancy consultation meetings should be done not just to discuss redundancy, but also to give the employee an opportunity to give their feedback and ideas on how redundancy can be avoided through discussing topics like redeployment into different roles, for example. Now, there are some things to consider when initiating the redundancy process, and these are that before you start any consultation process, you must notify the HMRC's redundancy payment service. If you offer voluntary redundancy, employees who volunteer for redundancy must still go through a fair selection process. So you can't just make employees redundant simply because they volunteered for it. If an employee volunteers for redundancy, they should go through the same fair selection process as those who are at risk of compulsory redundancy. As well as that, if you are making fewer than 20 redundancies, there is no requirement for a consultation period, so you could effectively give notice of terminating the employee's contract immediately, but it is best practice still to offer a consultation period. Now, once you have decided that you are making employees redundant, you can decide as well if employees will work their notice period or whether or not they'll be terminated immediately and paid in lieu of their unwork notice. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is a legal process, so if you are unsure about any part of it, you can seek support. ACAS have recently updated their redundancy page, particularly in relation to redundancy after furlough. As well as this, the HMRC website has a lot of in-depth information, but as well as this, the PayFit team and our payroll experts are on hand if you wish to contact us via Zendesk and raise a ticket so that we can support you around different parts of the redundancy process. So now we're going to take a look at notice pay, which is also called pay in lieu of notice. And this is a topic that has become quite prevalent for employers, particularly during furlough months, when employees who may need to be given their notice are not necessarily receiving full pay. So there are two types of notice. The first is statutory notice, which is the minimum amount that your employee is entitled to, and it's based on their length of service. And I've included the statutory minimum notice period by length of service in the table at the bottom of this slide for you. And the second type of notice period is the contractual notice period, which is the length of notice that the employee is given as per their contract of employment. Now, for those employees who are to receive the minimum statutory notice only, these employees must receive full pay, including any contractual benefits, even if they are not in receipt of full pay at the moment, and that may be because they are on furlough leave, they are on a period of unpaid sick leave, or they are on a period of unpaid or reduced paid statutory maternity, adoption, or paternity leave, for example. But what happens if you offer your employees a longer notice period? Now, if you offer your employees a longer notice period than the amount that they are statutorily entitled to, the amount that you pay them may just be based on the current rate of pay that they are receiving. If you offer a longer notice period, for example, your employee is given a month of notice when they are only entitled to a statutory week, the rate of pay that they are paid for is based on what they are contractually being paid at the moment, which means that employees who are on furlough leave and receiving 80% of pay may be paid 80% of pay for their notice period, whilst employees who are on unpaid sick leave or reduced pay on other periods of statutory leave may just continue to receive either zero or reduced pay for their notice period. So how do you work out if your employee should be receiving statutory notice or contractual notice? Because this will then dictate how much pay the employee receives during the notice period. So there are 4 steps that I've broken down for you. The first is if you take the date that the employee was giving notice, then next work out what the end of the notice period would be if the employee received their statutory notice only. Then work out what the end of the notice period would be based on what the employee is contractually entitled to. Next, work out the number of days difference between the statutory end date and the contractual end date. Now, if the contractual notice period exceeds the statutory notice period by 7 or more days, then you can pay your employee the current contractual rate of pay, which means you can continue to pay them their statutory maternity pay or their 80% of furlough pay. Now, if the contractual notice period is 6 days or less, is 6 or fewer days after the statutory notice period, then the employee is entitled to the statutory notice period, which means that they must receive full pay. Now, if you are unsure about what the employee is entitled to for their statutory minimum notice period, the PayFit app will tell you what this date is and how long the employee is entitled to as a statutory minimum in the termination screen in the PayFit app. Now let's take a look at how pay in lieu of notice is processed in the PayFit app, as this is dependent on whether or not your employee remains employed during their notice period, or whether or not they are being terminated with immediate effect and are being paid a lump sum for their notice period. Now, if your employee is at work and receiving full pay, or is on furlough leave but receiving 100% of their pay because you are topping up, there is no action that you need to take for their notice pay to be correct. If the employee is already receiving 100% of pay, there's no other step that you need to take for the app to process the employee's notice pay correctly. Now, if your employee does require full pay because they need the statutory minimum notice period, there are two options available to you. The first is that you can use the top-up feature in the furlough leave settings to increase the employee's pay to 100% for their notice period, and that will allow the employee to receive 100% of pay. If your employee is on a different type of leave, for example, a period of unpaid sick leave, you can use an additional pay element to input the equivalent of their notice pay so that the employee receives the correct amount in the payroll. Now, for employees who are paid in lieu of their notice period, the PayFit app will automatically calculate the number of days, the employee's day rate, and the total pay in lieu of notice amount based on the difference between the employee's final working day, which is this box here, and when the app expects the notice period should have ended. So what the app will do is it will look at the date that the notice is being given and the contractual notice period. If the final day of work comes before the end of the 4 weeks from the day notice is given, the app will automatically calculate anything owed to the employee as unpaid notice. Now, the pay in lieu of notice period in the app will be based on the employee's full 100% pay, excluding any contractual benefits. So if your employee is entitled to any contractual benefits, you will have the option in the termination screen to override this at a later date. And we just have some other things to note as well on paying notice pay in the PayFit app. So employees who remain employed during their notice period, who are also on furlough leave, can have their pay in lieu of, or can have their notice pay claimed through the coronavirus job retention scheme. But if you are making a one-off lump sum when the employee is terminated, such as this figure here, this amount cannot be reclaimed through the coronavirus job retention scheme. As I've mentioned, the PayFit app will always use the employee's 100% of salary, excluding benefits, to calculate pay in lieu of notice. And the app will calculate pay in lieu of notice in days from the final day of work to the end of the notice period. If you do want to increase the employee's pay in lieu of notice or override the amount that is being calculated by the app, then you can do so by entering a figure in the override value box here. Now, it is worth noting that whilst there is the option there, based on whether or not your employee can receive a contractual notice payment as opposed to a statutory notice payment, I would always recommend that when it comes to making notice payments to employees, that you would always opt to pay at a rate of 100% of salary. And the reasoning behind this is furlough is such an exceptional rule that wasn't necessarily taken into account when the pay in lieu of notice regulations were written, that it is much safer from an employer perspective to minimise the risk of any claims for unlawful deductions of wages to pay the employee at 100% of pay. Okay, now the last topic we're going to cover before I answer some of your questions is the topic of termination payments. Now, when I say termination payments, I refer to anything that the employee is entitled to receive when their contract of employment comes to an end. This is things such as unwork notice, unused annual leave, and any other entitlement to termination payments, including contractual and statutory redundancy pay. Now, just while I'm on the topic of unused annual leave doesn't have the same rules as pay in lieu of notice. So any untaken holiday that the employee is to be paid should always be paid at 100% of the employee's usual pay. Now, for employees who have 2 years service or more, they will be entitled to statutory redundancy pay, and this is worked out based on the employee's length of service and the employee's age at each full complete year of service. Termination payments cannot be claimed through the furlough scheme and the coronavirus job retention scheme, so the employer will need to consider and factor in the cost of this when planning any redundancies. And with all aspects of payroll, there are tax and national insurance implications. So any payments made for payment in lieu of notice and annual leave payments, they will be subject to the usual tax and national insurance that any base pay or any earnings will be subject to. A couple of years ago, it was possible to make pay in lieu of notice payments completely free of tax and national insurance, but the legislation has now changed and any pay in lieu of notice is now fully taxable. Any payments that are related to redundancy or ex gratia payments, which are discretionary termination payments you can make to your employees, are tax and national insurance free, up to £30,000. Anything over £30,000 is taxable for the employee and subject to Class 1 employer-only national insurance. Now, on this slide here, I've made a list of what the typical termination payments are, and I've indicated with the PayFit logo where these payments are automatically calculated by our PayFit app. Things like contractual redundancy pay and ex gratia payments aren't automatically calculated by the app simply because these amounts are subject to discretion by the employer. So it is the employer that decides how much the employee receives for these types of termination payment. So this is a free field for employers to input the amount of either contractual redundancy pay or ex gratia payment that they want to make to employees. Now, one of the main reasons that we automate the likes of pay in lieu of notice, holiday pay and statutory redundancy pay is that these are all payment types that employees are firstly legally entitled to based on their length of service or based on employment law or contractual law that's in place. So to have a set calculation and legislation behind them, we can keep our PayFit users compliant whilst minimising the payroll tasks that they need to do manually. Statutory redundancy pay in particular, if you do have a fair few redundancies to make, can significantly increase the time that it would take you to process a payroll doing the manual calculations. And with any manual calculations, there is then the risk of human error. So we automate as much of this process for you as we possibly can. So what do termination payments look like in the PayFit app? So as we've discussed, the likes of annual leave payments that you can see here and statutory redundancy payments, they are all calculated automatically for you based on the employee's salary. And for redundancy, this is based on the employee's length of service and the employee's age. If you want to overwrite any figures or you want to include the likes of contractual redundancy pay, then you can click on expand details and this will allow you to add additional contractual redundancy payments. Now, if you are terminating your employee for another reason, such as a settlement agreement, you can input a settlement agreement amount in here as well. And if you process any ex gratia payments, this may be because your employee doesn't qualify for statutory redundancy pay, but you also don't have any contractual provision for contractual redundancy pay. You may wish to make a completely discretionary payment to an employee, and you can do so by using the ex gratia box that we have here. Now, if you do terminate your employee, but you know that they will be receiving payments in a future month, maybe because they have some outstanding commission or overtime, you can also use the keep employee on payroll after leave date toggle and input the final date of the employee's payment so that the employee will remain visible to you in the PayFit app until that final payment has been made for you. Now, just some final things to note on termination payments in PayFit. All the tax and the national insurance legislation is fully automated, as it is with all of our pay elements and deductions in the app, and it's applied correctly to each type of payment. For example, you can input a redundancy payment, a contractual redundancy payment of £45,000, and the app will know to split out the £30,000 tax and national insurance free from the remainder, which will be subject to tax and employer Class 1A national insurance. So all you would need to do is input one figure and the app will do the rest for you. P45s will be generated after the payroll run in which the termination date has been added. So if you are making an employee redundant or terminating an employee in July, once the payroll has ran for July, the P45 for the employees will be available in the documents section of the app for you to distribute. And remember as well that this is a complicated process. That's one of the reasons today that we decided to do this webinar. So we are here to help if you need anything, even if it's not necessarily related to the way something works in the PayFit app. It's to do with a piece of legislation, or you still aren't 100% sure what type of notice pay you need to pay your employees. All you need to do is drop us a ticket on Zendesk, and we're more than happy to help. So that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to take a look now to see if we've got any questions that have been submitted that I can answer for you. Okay, so we have a question from Emily, and it's, are sick leaves considered discrimination criteria? Actually, Emily, they aren't to a degree. So ACAS does say that you can use the employee's absence record as a way of determining whether or not somebody should be made redundant. However, if the sick leave relates to something like because it's pregnancy related, or because it relates to an employee's disability, then you would have to discount those types of sickness. You could not include those types of sickness in the selection criteria for redundancy. And we have another question here from Emily, and that is, what are the differences between pay in lieu of notice and redundancy payment? Okay, so pay in lieu of notice is a taxable and deniable payment that your employee would receive for any notice that they hadn't already worked. Every employee who has been employed for more than a month has a minimum notice period that they should receive when their employment comes to an end. Redundancy payments are related to the employee losing their job, and it's almost it's a compensation payment for the employee effectively, and it's based on the employee's length of service. So it's only applicable, or statutory redundancy rather, is only applicable for employees who have 2 years of service or more, and it's also age related as well. So pay in lieu of notice is a contractual entitlement, and a redundancy payment is more like a compensation for the employee's contract being terminated. Do we have any more questions? I'll hang on a little bit because we still have plenty of time to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, we don't seem to have any more questions coming through at the moment. That's absolutely fine. It may be this is a topic that you don't really think about questions until you're actually having to do it. But as I've mentioned, we're always available on Zendesk, and we have different help centre articles around, annual leave or terminating contracts as well, to assist you in making these payments and making the process easier for you. So if you are unsure about anything, you can drop us a note on Zendesk. Oh, we have a question come in from Beth. And Beth has asked, if an employee is terminated and you use the keep on payroll toggle as they do a pension refund, could that affect their P45? Okay, so when it comes to P45s, the employee will only ever receive one, and it will be the one that is generated in the month that the employee is processed as a leaver. Any payments that are made to the employee after that are called payments after leaving, and that's a technical term given to the HMRC. That means that the payments are made after leaving, always using a 0T tax code, which means there's no tax-free allowance, so the employee will be taxed on everything, but we don't issue another P45. We do still report the figures to the HMRC, so the HMRC can then report them to the employee's new employer, but it won't affect their P45 because once that P45 has been issued, we don't make any changes to it. Okay, I'll still hang on a couple of minutes in case there's any more questions. Okay, it doesn't look like we're going to have any more questions come through at the moment. That's absolutely fine. So what I'll do now is I will bring the webinar to an end. So thank you very, very much for attending. I hope this has been helpful and informative and has given you what you need if you do need to make any contract terminations. And as I've mentioned, if you do have any questions related to employee terminations, you can visit our PayFit Help Centre, or you can access Zendesk and raise a ticket for us there. Brilliant. Thank you very much.